Executive Director.
This meeting is being recorded.
I don't know if you all heard that, but this meeting is being recorded. So my name is Jeff Buchheit, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director for Pride of Baltimore, Inc., the nonprofit that supports the tall ship Pride of Baltimore 2. Our 2022 Deeper Dive virtual lecture series features a special guest speaker on Thursday evenings around 7 o'clock from now until the end of March, skipping next Thursday, so it'll be 2 weeks from now. As I said last week, consider us to be your antidote to the winter blues. Today on the East Coast, the sun set, in Baltimore at least, slightly after 5:30. On March 17th, our last virtual lecture, the sun will set at 7:15, people. It'll still be daylight, and that's thanks to the time change on March 12th, but it'll still be daylight at this time during our final lecture. So spring is on the way. The series is made possible, and we can't thank them enough, with funding provided by the Maryland Humanities Council. You can check out their programs and special events and learn more about the Maryland Humanities Council by visiting www.mdhumanities.org. I want to thank the Maryland Humanities Council staff, Marilyn Hotza, Lindsay Baker, Maya Moretta, and Sarah Weissman. Note that Maryland Humanities Council is starting a new quarterly series called Lunch with Lindsay. Lindsay's the executive director, which will debut on February 17th at noon with a focused topic on racial equity in the Maryland Humanities Council. And those are free, so tune in. It sounds pretty cool. The purpose of the series is to take a deeper dive than we traditionally do with our interpretation with Pride of Baltimore. We typically focus on privateers, tall ships, the Chesapeake Bay, sailing, obviously. This series will introduce you to often untold stories of survivors, African Americans, Indigenous peoples, women, and others. In a moment, I'll introduce tonight's speaker. Before I do, however, there's just a couple more housekeeping things that I want to take care of and also give you a peek at what's to come. The platform we're using this evening is called Zoom Webinar. For the purpose of tonight's presentation, you'll only see our guest speaker, Michael Kent, myself as the MC, Patrick Smith, our program coordinator from time to time. At the end, he'll be monitoring the Q&A, and perhaps Captain Jan Miles will be joining us with any ship-specific questions. But Patrick Smith is also a former crew, so he can also answer many ship-specific questions as well. There are more than 100 people registered for this evening, so can you imagine if we had everyone's faces on here, it would just be chaos. So that's why with this Zoom webinar, you can only see the few of us. The chat is going to be turned off in a moment if it hasn't been already, and where we want you to post your questions. If you can, save the questions till the end, because quite likely your question might be answered as Michael gives his talk. But when you do place your questions, please place them in the Q&A that you can find at the bottom of the screen. Following Michael's presentation, we'll take time to answer the questions in the Q&A. And if we don't get to you, we apologize. With over 100 people, there might be too many for us to get to. So very quickly, in the weeks ahead, I want to highlight the speakers that we have to look forward to. On February 24th, Tim Grove, author of Star Spangled, The Story of a Flag, a Battle, and the American Anthem. Mr. Grove has authored numerous other books as well, and in fact will be releasing another book later this spring. On March 3rd, Kate Marks from the National Park Service will speak about the Star Spangled Banner National Historic Trail, and she'll be joined by other trail ambassadors from throughout the Bay with a focus on telling the stories of women along the trail. And what's really cool about her doing that on March 3rd is March 3rd is the anniversary of Fort McHenry National Monument and Historic Shrine joining the National Park Service, and also the anniversary of the Star Spangled Banner becoming our national anthem. We planned it that way. On March 10th, we have Jeffrey Bolster, author of Blackjacks, African American Seamen in the Age of Sail. And then to round out our series, on March 17th, we just confirmed this today, so we are super excited. We have Mario Harley of the Piscataway Conoy tribe, who will discuss the history and meanings of the Piscataway Conoy people in the Chesapeake Bay. Note that specifically for that one on March 17th, it will not be recorded. So if you do want to participate, you have to make sure that you actually register for that lecture. You can see why we're so excited about this. It's a great lineup. Remember to register for each one. You can do that by going to our website, www.pride2.org. Simply click on come aboard. While you're there, and then register. You have to register for each one of these individually. And also check out our online gift store while you're there. And you can purchase some fun things like shot glasses and t-shirts and some new coasters that we designed in the late fall for the holiday season. And also, if you feel so moved, please click the donate button because we really rely on all the private donations that we receive to keep our beautiful ship sailing. So now what we've all been waiting for, so you don't have to keep listening to me talk, is our wonderful guest speaker. Michael Kent, author of Mulatto, the Black History of Calvert County. Michael will be speaking about the choices enslaved Blacks had to make because of the 1814 British invasion of Southern Maryland. Michael was born in Calvert County in 1957, but can trace his roots in the county to 1780. After graduating from the University of Maryland undergraduate and law schools, Michael served as a judge advocate for the U.S. Naval Reserves and then as an assistant state's attorney in Baltimore City. After returning home to Calvert, Michael spent more than 20 years researching family and local history, which resulted in the book, Mulatto, the Black History of Calvert County, Maryland. I was so pleased to work with Michael last year when the boat sailed to Solomon's in St. Mary's City. And Michael was so wonderful to do some programming for us while we were there as we were all navigating COVID. And I know Michael prefers to do these things in person, but this tonight is virtual, and thanks to being recorded, we'll be able to spread the reach even beyond this evening's attendees. So without further ado, Michael, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm handing it off to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Patrick. Welcome, everybody. And again, thank you to Pride 2 and their Deeper Dive series. So I'm going to start off where we've started in other places in examining oral histories. Some of the groups that I've been involved with, and this started with the big conversation and the history coalition that we had there, we sort of agreed to accept oral histories as you find them. That's hard for me to do because some things don't sound right and I have to kind of dig at them to see if it's really true. So one of the things that always bothered me, I'm going to go back to this point before 1812 and 1814, is that everybody always says that they're descended from the Cherokee tribe. The Cherokee were not here in Maryland. We had the Patuxent tribe and other tribes associated with the Piscataway Indians, but regardless, people keep saying they're descended from Cherokee. White, black, whoever you talk to say Cherokee, never any other tribe but Cherokee. So at some point they say, okay, you have to accept this as oral history. There was one horny Cherokee that was running all over the state of Maryland impregnating people. So I'll say, okay, I'll agree with that. But I kept searching to see why people kept saying that there's some type of Native American background in their history. So this happened not too long ago. I was researching Matthias D'Souza, who was the first Black person, African descent, elected to the state legislature in the state of Maryland. Matthias D'Souza was elected in 1642 in St. Mary's, and he was a mulatto. He was half Portuguese and half African. And in researching him, I found that the first enslaved people brought to the Maryland colony were, for the most part, mulattoes of African and Portuguese descent. And the reason for that is first Africans were taken to Portugal, and the African women were, as you want to say it, as a reward given to the dock workers, the Portuguese dock workers. So in turn, there were a lot of mulatto children born. And then years and years later, as they grew, they decided they didn't want this many mulatto children around. And they were the first ones put on the ships that were sent to the Maryland colonies. And not only was D'Souza, and this was 1642, and we can't find any record of him after 1643. After they figured out that he was mulatto, he just sort of disappeared, and we don't know what happened to him. There was no record of him going any place and being lost or anything. He just sort of disappeared. The first enslaved African people brought to Calvert County in 1708 were also of Portuguese and African descent. That would explain some features that people would have, and also in DNA records where there was a large percentage of European DNA in the bloodstream, is because the original enslaved people that came to Calvert County in 1708 through St. Leonard Creek on the Fly, the slave ship, the Fly, were mulattoes at that time. So that was a research answer that I came up with to answer that question about why so many people seem to think they're descended from Native Americans. I was trying to answer other questions when I was researching my family's history, because they went back here again to 1780 in Calvert County. And I know they were here and I know where they were when the British came through in 1814. Just a little refresher on that. During the War of 1812, towards the end in 1814, the British came down the Chesapeake, and then they came up the Patuxent on their way to Washington, D.C., where they burned the White House. So all along the Patuxent, they were going either side, back and forth, Charles County, St. Mary's County, Calvert County, trying to do what they could to disrupt the economy. They were burning the courthouses, burning the crops, whatever else they could find. But the major disruption that they wanted to do was by freeing slaves, enslaved people. And my family was there in Lower Marlboro in Calvert County in 1814, and that's documented in the records because people had to put in for compensation for slaves that left, and the British had to pay that compensation. The owners of my family, they didn't have to pay for it because they didn't leave. And I was wondering, what's wrong with you people? Why didn't you leave? You had a chance. So that started research around that period. So what I was looking at is what choices they had in 1814 and why they made those choices. So one of the choices they had, and some made, in 1814, was to join the British. The soldiers that joined the British became known as Colonial Marines. So the Colonial Marines joined and fought with the British all the way through Washington, D.C. and afterwards. When the war was over, those Colonial Marines stayed with the British. The British withdrew to their, let's call it their base, because you can't keep going back and forth from England with supplies and things. So they established a base, a fort in Florida. Florida at that time, during the War of 1812, was still the property and in the sovereignty of Spain. So there was nothing the United States could do about them establishing a fort there. Originally called Fort Wilderness, later called Fort Gadsden and some other names. But when they withdrew from the United States to Florida, which was Spanish Florida, and that fort, the United States still wasn't happy about that because the treaty said that all British troops would be withdrawn from the United States. So Colonial Marines were technically not British troops. These were people that just signed on from America. So when the British left the fort in Florida, they left the Black Colonial Marines there, along with some other allies, the Indians, the Seminole Indians and the Choctaw Indians. So within the next year or so, more people started coming to that fort because there was a Black commander there. His name was Garçon. He was a Haitian, but he was running the fort. The soldiers there were Black, the Indians were there as well, and then other runaway slaves from Georgia and the Carolinas started showing up at this fort as well. So eventually the fort became known as Negro Fort because there were so many Blacks there at the fort. This again didn't sit well with the United States government, and in particular Andrew Jackson, who was not president, but he was a major general at that time. So they did a petition to the Spanish government to have them remove or ask them to remove that fort from their territory. While they were waiting for a response, because the Spanish government's governor was not in Florida, he was in Cuba. And so they had to send the ship to Cuba to get a response. While they were waiting, Andrew Jackson, who was impatient, naturally sent another ship there, a gunboat, to survey the area and to try to intimidate the people at the fort. He decided, well, there actually was a skirmish that happened and one of the American soldiers was killed. So this was more provocation for Andrew Jackson to intimidate the people to leave the fort. So what he did was with the gunboat, and he was not aboard, but one of his commanders threatened them, said, you need to leave, and they fired a warning shot. And again, this was a storage facility where they were shipping ammunition in for years from England to stockpile supplies there. And it so happened that one shot that they fired hit the ammunition. So there was a massive explosion that occurred. The entire fort was destroyed. More than 300 people inside the fort were killed. By that time, there were more than 1,500 people living outside the fort, Blacks and Indians, Native Americans, living outside the fort as sanctuary. So you can imagine with the massive noise and explosion that happened there, it terrified people. So the people inside the fort were killed, and the ones outside, hearing that explosion, just ran away. So they accomplished their goal. It's the shortest war in US history. One shot fired, ended the war, killing more than 300 people. There were a few survivors from the initial shot, and the the Americans turned those prisoners over to their allies. So, and their allies were the Creek Indians. And the Creek Indians scalped the surviving. They scalped Garcon, and they scalped the Choctaw chief. This was the actual start of the Seminole Wars, because again, Seminoles were inside as well. And they then decided to go to war against the Americans. So that didn't work out too well, that decision of the people that decided to join the Colonial Marines. There were others that still wanted to help the British, but not in such a formal manner. There were others who became privateers. Privateers is basically a legal pirate. You have the sanction of your local government to attack other ships and to sink them or to board them and steal their supplies, and then you would resell them to the government. So these privateers were in fact working for the US government. They would board British ships and steal whatever they could get and then resell them to the American government. So a lot of these privateers were run by former slaves. The most famous of them was a guy named Richard Crafis. And I have to mention this too, about history. So there's not a lot of digging you have to do to find this information. This is not unknown history. This is kind of ignored history. All you have to do is Google and Wikipedia, and you will find the story of Negro Fort. All you have to do is Google the name Richard Crafis, and you'll find what I'm going to talk about now about his stint with the being a prisoner of the British. Because eventually the British did capture Richard Crafis, who was from the Eastern Shore in Maryland, a very tall black man. All the letters and documentations described him as a 7-foot giant. So when he was imprisoned by the British, they took him to Dartmoor prison in England. And the prison in England was kind of set up like the Hogan's Hero. Imagine that, where they were all in housing units inside of this fort. The British were not at all interested in managing those prisoners. They would give them food, water, whatever supplies they needed, but they didn't stay involved in day-to-day activities. So that meant the prisoners managed themselves. And because Richard Crafis was so big, and all the letters saying he was 7 foot, although others in the actual that registered him, the British, said he's more like 6'5", 6'6". Americans at that time, or all Europeans at that time, the average height was probably 5'3", 5'4". So he looked like he was 7 foot tall to them. So because he was so big, he became the boss of the complex, and he would carry a club around with him, and he would refer to himself, obviously he's in charge, as his name was Richard, so he referred to himself as King Dick. And King Dick ruled with an iron hand in that compound. When the war ended, he had such power at that time that he said, I'd been a slave before, I don't want to be a slave again, and we're not leaving. We're not going back to the United States unless you can give us a guarantee that we're not going back to slavery. So it was actually 6 months after the war ended, the War of 1812 ended, before those prisoners were returned, because they had to negotiate with King Dick that the black prisoners would not be sent back to the southern part of the United States. They would go back to the northern part, where there was not the same slavery as in the southern part. So he was able to manage that. So that was a good outcome for him and those people. There were another set of people that just left with the British. And we have cousins because of that in Nova Scotia, Canada, and we have cousins in Jamaica and in Trinidad. They just got aboard the ship with the British. Again, they didn't have time because they were in war to go all the way back to England. So they dropped them off at these locations, Nova Scotia, Trinidad, and Jamaica. The majority of the people, which included, well, let me go to one other first. There was one set that actually decided to fight with the Americans. And we know about them because of Charles Ball. Charles Ball is the reason we know, or I know, in fact, most of the history that I give you, that I've been giving you. Charles Ball was born in Calvert County as a slave, and his first memories as a slave were being torn away from his mother, somebody hitting his mother as a white man, and he was naked, about 4 years old, was pulling him away to take him away from the mother. It turns out that that's the main way that order was kept during slavery, because usually you had massive number of slaves on these plantations and farms, far outnumbering what the white population was on that farm or plantation. The owners and the overseers were well outnumbered. So you'd think they'd be overrun at any time. They were not, because of their strategy of family separation. That's how you kept people in check. You take away a child, you take away a mother or father, move them somewhere else, and these people would not revolt against them, because again, this is where the family may come back to look for them. And the reason too it worked as far as keeping control of people, you're more likely to have somebody get upset and attack you if they see some harm coming to a family member, to a brother, sister, or mother or father. Regardless of what harm might come to the slave themselves, they're more likely to attack someone that has done some harm to a family member. That was another reason for the family separation that they did. So Charles Ball was born in the late 1770s, I think it was, in Calvert County. He was immediately separated from his mother. His father was still in the area, so he was able to learn some things from his father and also his grandfather. And his grandfather told him that he had come from Africa. So this was now third generation, and this was in the 1780s, that was living here in Calvert County in slavery. As time went on, eventually, well, let me skip ahead. Charles Ball wrote a book about this at the end of the time in slavery, and that's how we know some of the things that happened. One of the things he had in his book was how slave life was. You may have 20, 25 people living in a cabin, and you pretty much had a 6-day work week. On the 7th day, Sunday, you could do what you wanted. You could take the day off, or you could go visit other farms and plantations where family members may be, or court a lady or gentleman at another farm. Or you could work, and a lot of people chose to work in order to buy their way out of slavery. So as he was working on another farm, he met someone, they married, they had children. He came under, again, that same arm of let's separate the families. So for no fault of his own, he was then sold down to South Carolina. And shortly after he was sold there, some family member died, and he was transferred as property inherited by someone in Georgia. And the people in Georgia, according to his book, were much more severe and cruel than the ones in Carolina. So after 7 years, he was able to escape from Georgia and work his way back to Maryland. And it took him about a year to come back. It took me a while to understand this as to why he came back to Calvert County. I would think he would go on to Canada, to freedom. But the reason he came back to Calvert County is because that's where his family was, and he wanted to get back to them. He came back to Calvert County just about the time of the War of 1812. So in his mind, that if he joined the Americans in their fight, that he would be rewarded with his freedom and papers. At that time, whether you were free, whether you were enslaved, you had to have papers on you if you were a person of color. Anywhere you went, you had to show that you had papers on you that said you were free or you were enslaved, belonging to someone to give you permission to transfer, to walk anywhere at that time. So he decided to join the Americans and show his loyalty to the Americans and fight for them. And he fought for them, and he fought well. He was on the ship with Admiral Joshua Barney during the Battle of Bladensburg. The ship was hit, and I think he was just a cook or something like that initially, or a laborer, and he helped with the cannons and the guns in order to save that ship and became a hero in the War of 1812. There are no statues or monuments to him in Calvert County, but there is a statue of Charles Ball in Bladensburg in Montgomery County, honoring his contributions in the War of 1812. The reward he received from Calvert County is at the end of the war, they ignored what he had done. He had already at the end of the war saved up enough money to buy some land for himself and his family. He had a couple of children at that time. So his wife and children, he bought a little farm for them. But that didn't make any difference. He didn't have any papers on him saying that he had permission to be where he was. So they said, you're a slave, you were a slave, and you're a runaway slave. So he was sent back to Georgia. It didn't take him as long. It did take him several months, but not as long to work his way back to Calvert County again. By the time he came back, his wife and children had been sold into slavery. His land was sold as well. So he came back to nothing. He couldn't find anybody, had no way of finding anyone else. And that's when he finally moved on from Calvert County. He went up to Pennsylvania, and that's where he wrote his book, Charles Ball, The Life of a Slave. That gives you a lot of information about slave life in Calvert. That was published in the 1830s. Of course, he couldn't read or write, but he did dictate it to someone else. So that didn't work out for him, fighting for the Americans. Other people, again, as I said, they went to Trinidad, Tobago, and other places like that. But there were some, like my family, who were there. My family in 1814 were owned by the Daniel and Ann Wheeler Kent in Lower Marlboro. And census records at that time in 1820 show that they had more than 60 slaves. Again, they could have overrun these people, but again, family members were spread out and they wanted to be near them. The reason they decided to stay was just because of that. They knew that the children and other relatives that had been sold away somewhere else, if this slavery ever ended, would come looking for them back in Calvert County. If they left with the British, they wouldn't know where to go to find them. There were also practical reasons for not leaving. Again, there was a fear that if they left with the British, they could be taken to a worse place. Again, I say it didn't work out. They were practical. It didn't work out for them the first time. They got on a ship with a white man. Why is it going to be better the second time? And you might be taken to a place where you have to learn a whole new language and have that beaten into you like it was the first time around. And can you imagine at this point too, and this is 1814, someone with the black Southern dialect trying to communicate someone with a British Cockney accent. I think they might have understood half of what each one was saying to each other. So there was that fear, I don't know what you guys are saying, so why should I follow you? The other thing they were looking at is, again, they had been there for several generations at that time, and they saw that there were other ways out of slavery than running away. You could buy your way out. As Charles Ball had said, you could work jobs on Sundays and you could make money and you could buy your way out of slavery. They also saw that you could age out of slavery. I've never worked cotton, but I have worked tobacco, and that is backbreaking work. It ages you overnight. And again, this is not people driving tractors and things or even using mules. They were doing everything, every aspect of the tobacco trade by hand, using a makeshift hoe, grubbing hoe to dig up the soil and everything, and planting the tobacco by hand and cutting it and taking it up. So that was backbreaking work. And although slaves could be valued as high as thousands of dollars at that time, a young man, he was pretty much worthless by the time he got into his 40s. He was worked out. The women were worked out as well by the time they were in their early to mid 40s. And oftentimes the owners of these enslaved people would say, it's cheaper to just give you your freedom, give you your manumission papers and let you go than continue paying for food and clothing and housing when I'm not going to get that amount of work from you as I would get from a young person. So they knew that they could just wait these people out and then wait for their family to come back, find work in the area and wait for their family to come back at some point. So they were actually pretty clever, pretty smart in working that philosophy out. And they could do other things while they were waiting for their family to come back. Now, there was a lot of harsh treatment of those slaves at times who did stay. We have stories from the Middleham Chapel about the Isaac Brown story, that he was falsely accused of attacking his master, savagely beaten and put in jail, beaten again, and then sold south to New Orleans. He was able to escape with the help of friendly Quakers before he was taken down there, and they took him to Pennsylvania. And then Maryland filed the case against Pennsylvania and have him brought back because he was a black slave and he didn't have any rights. He was not a human. He didn't have any rights. So there was no such thing as you can't be punished twice for the same crime. And they wanted him back to punish him again. And they lost that case. The Pennsylvania lost that case and agreed to return him. Before they could do that, again, some friendly people, white people, who helped a lot with slaves that were running away at that time, got him to freedom and got him all the way to Canada. When he finally got to Canada, again, the people that thought he was worthless and just worth beating and not a person, he ultimately became a doctor in Canada. You have other horror stories, especially of the women, the slave breeding that went on at that time. We have documents from Horace Greeley, other noted people that labeled Maryland and Virginia as slave breeding states. It was about 1800, I think it was, that Thomas Jefferson ended the slave trade from Africa to the United States. His reason behind that was because tobacco is a very unstable crop. You might have a couple of good years, but one bad year and you're wiped out. They needed a stable crop that they could sell. The stable crop that Maryland and Virginia needed were slaves, because there was always a need for more slaves in the South. And Maryland sold a lot of slaves, babies, down to the southern states during this time. You also had, again, some other prominent people. We have newspaper articles where the governors of Georgia, Kentucky, and other states were saying, we're not worried about labor because we can always get more labor from slave breeding Maryland and Virginia, as verification that this was actually happened. And I found an article by a guy named Jacob Broom, who lived here in Calvert County, and he kept track of his own record. Don't know that it's something to be proud of, but he was proud of it, to say that he fathered more than, I think it was more than 125 children during his term working here in Calvert County over at the Chesapeake Beach. So there was hardship, but there was also still more opportunity here in the United States than in other places. And one of those opportunities was aboard ship. So merchant ships and ships like the Pride too did hire blacks and free blacks. Sailing on the sea is, next to slavery and farming, a miserable life, because you're out at sea alone for months and months at a time. You never know when your life is going to end, when there's going to be a hurricane or something that comes along to overturn the ship and you'd be dead. And this life itself in getting a ship from one port to the other was miserable. But that was better than slavery, so that a lot of blacks would join these merchant ships. I think the stat I had was like 40% of the merchant ships from 1800 to 1860 were manned by free blacks. So they would stay on there, and the pay was really good. You could get $20, $40, $60 a month, depending on which shipping line that you were with. So blacks would stay on these ships for 15, 20 years at a time. Young white men or boys would come on at 14, 16 and say, this is a miserable life. I can do something better somewhere else, anywhere else. And they would leave after usually the first tour or the first time they could jump ship and go someplace else. So as a result, the black sailors enjoyed seniority for being on there for so long. And when you're on board ship, and hopefully you'll be able to come and board the Pride 2 when it comes back this year, you see what the small spaces were on there. Everyone, there was no segregation. Everyone worked together. They ate together. They slept together. They played together when they went to ports overseas. And the black sailors had seniority. So they were never officers, but they were senior enlisted, and they were in charge and gave orders to the younger white sailors that were on there, telling them what to do. And if they disobeyed an order, they could whip the young white sailors. And we have a story of then someone, a black sailor, whipping a young white sailor aboard ship. But then when that ship pulled into harbor here in the United States, down in New Orleans, that same black sailor that had whipped the white sailor, when they came upon him on land, on dry land, would have to bow his head and step aside for him when he's on dry land here in the United States. So, but still, that was better than other options they had. So there were a lot of black sailors that would keep family on shore here in the United States, and still go out to sea for months at a time and come back. I have oral history in my family that one of my family members was a sailor. And if you look at the census records from the 1870 and also 1860 here in Calvert County, you'll see that there were a lot of seamen and sailors listed as occupation for people here for black people here in Calvert County. And you wonder why. They would go to other areas, other countries, but yet they still would come back to the United States to live. Whether it's for cultural reasons or whatever, I don't know. They didn't know the language, didn't want to learn it or whatever was going on, but they would still come back to the United States prior to the Civil War. The particular ancestor that I'm talking about, a great grandfather, was coming back, and he fathered child here in the 1850s. So he was still out at sea in the 1850s and coming back here and leaving his family here in Calvert County as he went out to sea. The other opportunities these sailors had, well, I forgot one part that I promised somebody I'd mention. It was not only the sea was not only freedom for the black slaves, it was freedom for white women, because they were next to slaves during that time period, and they often would disguise themselves as men and go aboard these merchant ships and sail with them. And the question is, okay, how do you go so long not being discovered as a woman when you're out at sea with all these men? And the answer is, during that time, the 1800s, early 1800s, taking a bath, changing your clothes was a bad thing. I always wondered why, you watch your Westerns and everything as you're growing up, the Bonanza and everything, very rich men wore the same clothes every day. So that's actually accurate. People did wear the same clothes every day. They were afraid that taking a bath would make you sick. So you didn't have to worry about changing your clothes in front of other men, because nobody ever did. But you'd go a year or two and the clothes would be falling off of you, and you wouldn't have to worry about anybody wondering what your sex was. The other thing that comes up in your mind, or people like me, is what about going to the bathroom? So the term head is in Navy terminology even today. When you go to the bathroom, you go to the head. It's called the head as opposed to a bathroom. When you went to the bathroom there, because when I was asking people on ship, where do they go to the bathroom? Did you keep it downstairs? And well, no, that would smell up the entire lower decks. You kept a bucket up front, and you kept it at the head of the ship. And people would go to the bathroom, the bucket, the head of the ship. So for those of you who are not that bright like me, and you try to water your garden or you wash your car in the wind, that water is going to blow back in your face. So the sailors were a little smarter than me, and they said, well, I'm going to sit down in order to go to the bathroom, regardless of what I'm going to do, so it doesn't blow back into my face. So the women didn't have to expose themselves, because they would just go to the head of the ship, and you have these long cloaks and things over you, and you sit in the bucket. Then you ask the question about monthly bodily fluids. At that time, people pretty much ate meat and potatoes. Their diet was terrible during that time period. So a lot of people had digestive problems. And it's not uncommon for men to have a lot of blood in their stool because the diet that they had was so bad. A friend of mine who may be on here tonight, Mark Willis, who was our county administrator, he told me a story that I didn't know about Lewis and Clark, because he's a Lewis and Clark expedition fan like I am, that they could map the Lewis and Clark expedition and see where they went. Because of their digestive problems, the lousy food they were eating, they were taking a lot of mercury. And so you could just trace that mercury along to see the path that the Lewis and Clark expedition followed. So to get away from now the bodily fluids in that era, the other thing that people were able to do as merchant seamen is that you had contact. There was a lot of talk about Underground Railroad, but not really much of an explanation as to how that worked. So in Maryland, the seamen, the merchant seamen, had a lot to do with the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad is pretty much communicating with people, passing along where you can go, directions to get places to safe houses. And most of the safe houses or farms, again, were owned by white people who were sympathetic to slaves. Not just the Quakers, but many other people were abolitionists, and they would house and feed runaway slaves. It was the merchant seamen who had access to different ports all through southern Maryland, through the western shore and over to the eastern shore, that had access to people to say, hey, this is a route that you can take. This is a place that is safe, because they would be loading the cargo onto the ship, whether it be the tobacco or other fruits, vegetables, or livestock. And the people loading onto the ship were other enslaved people. So that was the contact that they would have to pass information along, vital information along to people that were enslaved if they wanted to run. One of the excerpts I found, because again, a lot of enslaved people were interviewed in the 1930s that would survive that long, and they would talk about being told about, this is what they knew about Calvert County, Anne Arundel counties, the way they pronounced it, Baltimore, and back of Baltimore. So their goal was always to get back of Baltimore, and they were given these routes and to follow to get back of Baltimore, which would then get you over to the eastern shore and on to another state and to freedom. So they had this vital job as seamen, as part of the Underground Railroad, to give this information to other people. The other thing, and this is another oral history thing that I always question, another good friend of mine, Alan Reed, who's a great singer. If you ever have the opportunity to hire a singer, hire Alan. Sings songs from the slave era like Wade in the Water. And he tells a story about, you would sing the song Wade in the Water to warn people to get into the water so that you wouldn't be tracked by the hound dogs. And I would always ask the question, well, how would they know that anybody's coming? Would you just sing that song every day? How would you know that there's a runaway slave somewhere along the line because you didn't advertise when you were about to run? But again, they were a little smarter than me, and they could figure out when there was activity going on. If there was a runaway slave coming into your area, that word was passed ahead either by fast horse or later by the wire, by the telegraph ahead. So the people would be on the lookout, and they would notice that the people that owned the hound dogs would be put on alert. Their dogs would be gathered and sent along certain paths. Other people would congregate together. So they knew certain activity meant that a slave was on the run. And that's when they would start singing those songs when they were in the fields very loudly to do what they could to help these people along. So, and I'm going to be closing down here shortly so that you can ask any questions if you have them, is that the thing that impresses me about Black history is that they were always looking to the next generation. I want to stay where I am so that you can find me. I want to do what I can do to help you move ahead. The Underground Railroad, I'm enslaved here, but I will pass the word any way I can, even if it means singing songs to give somebody else the opportunity for freedom. And so that's the message I wanted to leave with you tonight. And I'll stop here and turn it back over to Jeff and Patrick.
Thank you, Michael. I swear I could listen to you talk for hours. I learned so much. And so I've actually got a question. So everyone, I should say real quick, if you have questions, start posting them in the Q&A, and then Patrick's going to join us and he's going to monitor and pass his questions on to Michael. As people are posting in there, Michael, if people want to hear you more, when's the next opportunity?
Well, when's your ship coming in again? So,
sometime this spring, we hope. So yeah, and that'll be live. So that'll be good.
Okay, so we are doing something, putting together an exhibit at Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum at the end of this month. We'll have an opening hopefully around February 26th, and I will speak there. And again, a lot of it depends on COVID and churches. I used to do a lot of programs for Black History Month at churches, but when they open again, if they invite me, I'll come.
Great. All right, Patrick, do you want to feed Michael the questions?
Certainly. So the first question was, so Michael, are you familiar with a book called Americana? Sharon Parker was wondering. I believe it's a book about, I'm not sure, but does it ring a bell at all?
No, I'm not familiar with that book either. I kind of tried to not read other people's works so that I wouldn't copy it when I was writing my material.
Okay. Yeah, it's a novel. It's by a Nigerian author, so it sounds like it might be worth checking out. The next question we've got is, so you mentioned British payments to owners of slaves they liberated. Was this part of the treaty again? Could you elaborate on that more?
Yes, this is, of course, during the Civil War, the American government paid slave owners to let their slaves come into the military, and I think that was around $200-300. But and I think it was around $200 during the War of 1812 as compensation for the damage that the British did in allowing slaves to escape, to run away. Any property they lost, or the courthouse that was burned here in Calvert County, they received compensation from that through that treaty as well, that the British had to reimburse since they lost.
Well, excellent. Thank you. Man, questions are rolling in. I got another one for you. Can you remind us of the name of the Calvert County slave who lost their family and wrote a book?
Yeah, his name is Charles Ball. Charles Ball, The Life of a Slave. The title is probably 20 words long. He was very verbose. Charles Ball, The Life of a Slave, who lived in Calvert, who went to Georgia, who did that. It's a very long title, but just if you remember Charles Ball, The Life of a Slave, you'll find it.
Excellent.
And again, a lot of this material I received with the help of Calvert Library. I have to mention them because some of them are on this Zoom call and they're mean people when you cross them, but they assisted me in so many ways in finding this material in the archives, working with computers with I'm lost about, but they assisted me in so many ways in finding this material.
And that's actually a perfect segue into this next question. In your research, can you tell us about how the difficulties you have finding historical records for Calvert County? Can you tell us about some of your sources and things like that?
The two main difficulties in finding records, number one is fire, because so many things burned down. The courthouse here burned down 5 times. So I don't even know where the Kent family that owned us in Lower Marlboro were, because their records, land records, were burned by the British, and then there were several fires after that. Churches, everything was made of wood and everybody had a fireplace. So all the old Black churches burned down with their records as well. Stores, things burned down. The second problem I had in recovering information was, not, hopefully don't offend anybody, but were wives. The wives kept making their husbands clean out garages and things like that, the basement, and throwing away material. So when I ran out of sources from the churches and the courthouses and everything, I started going to old families like the Goldstein family and the Armiger family that owned a lot of property and that owned stores and things, going to their children and grandchildren, asking them if they still had any material. And they said, well, you're like 10 years late. My wife made me throw it away.
Oh, man. And if you don't mind, we're going to keep this rolling. Do you know what's going on to get more Black history like this into secondary school classes? It sounds like you said earlier you were just at a class today, so it sounds like you're kind of leading the charge
Yes,
with
and
that.
that question came up. The kids were asking that question. The superintendent and current superintendent of schools were there, and Dr. Curry and Sandy Walker, who's in charge of this diversity. They were there at the high school. That was the question that was asked of them. And they couldn't give a definite answer. And also there's a school board member there who couldn't give a definite answer because he said so many factors go into this as to what they're able to put into the curriculum. They've got to teach to the test on one hand. And again, you have the input of parents and other family members as to what goes into the curriculum. And you have to have the child prepared for the next level. And a lot of times the history just becomes the secondary thing, just like civics. It's not on a regular curriculum. It's when you can get it as an elective. So they couldn't give a definite answer as to it being a permanent fixture at any of the schools here. So it's kind of catch it when you can. And one of the things we talked about, and I mentioned earlier, there are other organizations like the big conversation, their history coalition, and places like Southerly Plantation, that they do a lot of these same types of programming. Nancy Easterly does a lot of these programs down at Southerly. Calvert Library does a lot of programs. They have another program coming up in March. They're going to show a movie on the 688s, which is about the Black women in military in World War II. So they do a lot of programs. So you can get it in other places as opposed to just in the school system.
Okay. And so we've got just a couple more questions for you. So, this is a really excellent one. So how much typically would a slave have to earn on Sundays to buy their freedom? Possibly how many months or years of extra work?
It would usually take years. One of the people I really liked talking about, his name was N.M. Carroll. N.M. Carroll was a slave in Calvert County. He was born, it was called Smithville. It became Dunkirk after that because they figured out there was someplace else called Smithville over on the Eastern Shore and they weren't getting their mail. So they changed their name from Smithville to Dunkirk. He was born there in the 1840s, I believe it was. I know he left Calvert County. It took him 10 years to buy his way out of freedom and also his father's way out of slavery. He went to Baltimore in 1857 and went to seminary school, became a bishop in the church. And N.M. Carroll, coming from slavery and buying his father's freedom to take him up to Baltimore with him, he started the first Black old folks home, senior housing for Blacks, because coming out of slavery, obviously you had no money, you had no place to stay. He founded that. And if you go into Baltimore now, you will still see his name as you're coming into the Inner Harbor that says N.M. Carroll Senior Housing. It's still named after him today. And he went up there in the, as I said, in 1857. His obituary, when he died in the 1830s, he said, the thing in my life, and he started like 20 churches in Baltimore and around that area. He said, the thing that I'm most proud of was the 10 years I spent in Calvert County earning money to buy my father's freedom.
And so next up, we've got can you tell us, let's pick a good, there's so many good questions. So I'm just, so everybody knows, I'm going through a lot of like really interesting questions. We might be here all night. So were there many African-Americans under the command of Commodore Barney? And in particular, are you familiar with any at the Battle of St. Leonard or of St. Leonard's Creek or Bladensburg?
It's Bladensburg. I don't remember the names. There were at least 3 total. It could have been more, could have been 4 or 5, but it's 3 that I remember and there weren't very many that chose to fight with the Americans, but I remember there were at least 3 that fought with the Americans on that ship.
Excellent. And this is a pretty interesting question. Do you happen to know what happened to the women who left with the British? Have you found anything in your research?
No, because they haven't reached back. There have been some people from Canada, from Nova Scotia, that have reached back. The Dare family, and we have a road here in Calvert County, Dares Beach Road, and they were enslaved on Dares Beach Road and took that name, and they were in Nova Scotia. And through whatever you do through Ancestry, they have done this chart, and he said, we were here in Calvert County at this time, and they wanted to know of any relatives that were left here. We have the names of people that left for Trinidad and Jamaica, but they're not local names that I recognize, and I haven't heard of anything of what happened to them in the end.
Okay. And I think, Jeff, do you want to, how do you guys feel? It looks like we got 2 questions left. Do you just want to, we go with those and go from there? So actually, it's just, this is actually a perfect question. So are you familiar if there's an oral history program in Calvert County? And then simultaneously, I'm going to tack on to that a little bit. Michael, do you know of any historic sites or museums in the Southern Maryland area that tell these stories? Like, you know, if somebody's interested in learning more, do you have any good recommendations for them?
Okay, for the first part, I mean, there are a lot of oral histories around different places. The Calvert Marine Museum has some, Bayside Museum has some. I think Jefferson Patterson Park has a little, the Calvert Library has some. And for the last couple of years, every time there's an NAACP event, we try to record more oral histories. The problem is storing them, because in Calvert County government, the planning and zoning has oral histories. The problem is storing them safely and making them accessible to the public. So that's one of the things the History Coalition that I talked about before is working on, is to find a way to store them safely and to make them available to the public. But there's still many more stories out there that we haven't captured yet. I'm sure great stories that people have about their family. So we'd still love to hear from anybody that wants to talk to us about anything that has been passed down amongst their family. And this, I forget, what was the second part of that? As far as one central place.
So for folks looking in the Southern Maryland area to learn more, you know, are you familiar with any historic, would you recommend any historic sites for them to visit to learn more about this kind of history?
That's, again, it's part of the things the coalition is working on to find a central site, whether it be the library or the historical society. Our director there is John Johnson. He works on these things tirelessly, trying to get this information in as well. And also all the museums and Jefferson Patterson Park as well are working on this now, trying to find a way of having people access this history as it comes in. But right now, there's not one central place. Same thing with all of Southern Maryland. I've talked to other people from Charles and St. Mary's County. They have the same issue there, and storing it, because apparently it takes a lot of whatever gigabytes are, it takes a lot of gigabytes to store all this information.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up, because otherwise we'd have you here all night, Michael. And I'll share that our assistant director was typing and sending us the name, and it's already gotten lost in the on the screen. But the title of the book, Charles Ball's book, our assistant director Erica says it's the longest title she's ever seen in her life, and it's like 30 words long. So anybody, you know, Google that when we end tonight, because that is fascinating. I've never seen. They were like, I couldn't even read the whole thing.
Yeah, he wanted to be sure that people got his stories, and you might not open up the book to read it, so put it all in the title. In the title, right? There you go. So thank you, Michael. Cannot thank you enough for this. I hope people are able to enjoy. And you said, I think I wrote it down here, February 26th at Jeff Pat, the exhibit. Yes,
wall?
Jefferson Patterson Park. That's our goal, to open it up on the 26th. And it was the help of graduate students from the University of Maryland, from the Environmental Lab in Solomons, put together these great story maps that we're going to be displaying.
That's really cool. So for those who are local, and the thing about Zoom, I mean, we could have people on here that are in California, but for those who are local, try to get to Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. It is an amazing place. So thank you again, Michael. I want to thank the Maryland Humanities Council again for funding this virtual lecture series. We couldn't do it without that support. And also, please provide funding and support to Pride of Baltimore. Our ability to sail. There's a lot of misunderstandings out there. People think that we're fully funded by the state of Maryland, but we are not. The state covers our budget at a level of about 40%. which leaves us the other 60% to bring in through earned income and through private donations. So go to our website, click the donate button, and a really cool thing, if you join what's called the Privateer Society, that's where you give at least $5 a month. You'll be invited for you and a guest to come out on a couple of free sails during the sailing season. So it's really cool. If you don't already have a copy of Mulatto, The Black History of Calvert County, you can always purchase a copy on Amazon. If you use the link that was shared in our promotion, then actually Pride Inc. actually gets a small cut from that out of the Amazon Associates program. So please keep that in mind. Also, if you shop on Amazon, you can always sign up through Amazon Smile. And if you make Pride Inc. your designated charity, we would get a small commission off of all the shopping that you do on Amazon. So without further ado, thank you again, Michael. Please, for those that are interested, on February 24th, join us for children's book author Tim Grove. That'll be a really fun episode as well. So Michael, any final words? Like, this has been awesome.
Well, I'm good. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Please tune in on the 24th.